Hello students, and welcome to Parts of a Cell by Mrs. Krupp. In this video I will be helping you understand a little bit better the organelles that we have been studying for the past couple of weeks. The first cell that we are going to go through is the eukaryotic cell, and this one is an animal cell. We can tell because all we see is a membrane. We don't see a cell wall. The first organelle that I would like to talk with you about is the nucleus. Okay, one of the key things about a nucleus, the way you can identify it is you're going to see this little thing right in here, and that is called a nucleolus. So if you're having to identify a nucleus on a cell map, the best way to be able to do it is to look for the circle and look for the nucleolus inside if you see a cross section of it. So the nucleus acts like a brain, and it controls all of the functions of a cell, and it houses the genetic material. So it is like some of the analogies that we've used in class are that it's like a brain, or the principal of a school building, or the president. So it's kind of the boss of the cell, and it controls all of the things that the cell does. And all of this is communicated by using chemicals. So the instructions for cell activity are controlled through chemicals. Okay, so that's the way it is communicated to the different parts of the cell. Okay, so as we move on to the next organelle, we are going to be looking at the cell membrane. Now, the cell membrane is important because every single cell, regardless of whether it's a prokaryote or a eukaryote, has a cell membrane. So as we look at this cell, we can see here, this is a plant cell. It is a eukaryote, which means it has a nucleus, and we can see here's the nucleus. We see the cell wall, and very, very slightly right here, we see the cell membrane. So when we look at the cell membrane, this is a really good diagram because it kind of gives us a little bit of an idea of the function. And this is the cell membrane right here is a flexible barrier separating inside and outside of cell. But more importantly, the cell membrane allows nutrients and proteins and other kinds of materials, water, in and out of the cell. So it can evacuate waste, but it can also take in the nutrients and the chemicals and the sugars that the cells needs for communication and energy and that kind of thing. So when we talk about the cell membrane, we think of a cell membrane like a door, and it lets nutrients and proteins are very, very essential for cells, in and out of the cell. And so if we think of it like a door, we know doors open and close, and that's a pretty simple analogy for what a cell membrane does, even though the membrane is really all around the cell. So if we had the nucleus here and then we had all this other stuff here, the whole thing would act as a door. The next organelle that we want to talk about, looking at it in the plant cell, is the vacuole. And so we've talked about the nucleus and the cell membrane, but now being able to identify a cell that you're not sure whether it's a plant or an animal cell, one of the simplest ways is to look for the vacuole. You're going to see, here's the vacuole right here. Now, when you're looking at this in different diagrams, the vacuole is going to be as big or bigger than the nucleus in a plant cell. So when you see that, you can automatically say, hey, I see two organelles that are pretty close to the same size. One of them must be a vacuole. So if we're talking about one large vacuole, then it's got to be a plant cell. And you can double check yourself by checking for the cell membrane and the cell wall. and also anything that could possibly be a chloroplast. So the vacuole is like a refrigerator, and it stores food, water, and waste. Now, obviously, we don't keep our waste in the refrigerator, so you might think of it like a trash can as well. But this is really kind of a good analogy for it, because all of the good things that the cell needs, like the food and the water, are stored in the vacuole. And so remember, a plant has one, and an animal cell has several. And the one in the plant cell is very large. The next thing that we are going to look at here that we have been studying are the mitochondria. Now, cells have, plant and animal cells have a couple of these, maybe even more than just a couple, but our diagrams show, 3 or 4 sometimes. So in a plant cell, we can see them, and they typically look the same in the plant and animal cells. But the mitochondria, what you'll usually see are these little kind of zigzaggies lines. So if you look for the zigzags on something that looks sort of like a bean, you're probably looking at the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the creates and stores energy for the cell. It gives the cell all the energy it needs to do the communication. So we're going to call this a source of energy. And the simplest thing I can think of for you to remember this is a power bar. It's like a power bar. And so when we eat a power bar, we get kind of a bolt of energy, and we're able to go on and do things, and we can, even if we're hungry, we can just eat that and we'll go forward. So it's kind of like a little power bar. Little power bars running around in the cell. And so it is something that is absolutely essential, because cells, like human beings, expel and spend their energy, and they're going to need a constant supply of energy to do all of the things that they need to do. So the next thing that we're going to look at in terms of, really this is all cells, this is prokaryotes and eukaryotes. All of these cells, besides having the cell membrane, which is essential and that supports cell theory, the other thing is that they all have genetic material. And all of this genetic information is right here in the nucleus. And so every single thing, regardless of whether it is a prokaryote or a eukaryote, has genetic material. But we know that prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. So the genetic material is just encased in this cell. It's just kind of there floating around like little strings. It's not in a nucleus. So there is genetic material, but it doesn't look like this. The genetic material is like an instruction manual, and this has genes, and it is the DNA has the genes, and it gives directions for the organism's composition and operation. So what I mean by that is how the cells are going to how the cells and the tissues and the organs and the organ systems are all going to function, that they're going to be healthy and that they're going to replace themselves, but also that the composition. So what I mean is for like a human, it's going to identify and tell the cells how to create themselves so that the human being looks a certain way. For example, I have blonde hair and blue eyes, and my hair is curly, and I have fair skin. All of that material is stored, all of that information is stored in the DNA. And so if we think about a dog, dogs are, they're all the same breed. And, if we wanted to mix a couple of dogs to get a mixed breed, like I know they make like Chihuahua dogs or a Labradoodle or something like that, we can go ahead and breed those dogs, and they can mix with each other. However, the DNA for, like, let's say the Chihuahua, that dog is going to look a certain way, whereas the Dachshund has the little long skinny body and the big little ears and the cute little face. So when you combine that DNA together, you get an animal that looks is kind of a combination of both animals. And so all of that information is stored in the DNA. So that's the same for any bacteria or plants. Plants are going to be a certain way, and animals as well. So when we go on to the next slide, so as we look at this slide, we're going to move into the first few things that we've talked about are for plant and animal cells. So they're for all eukaryotes. But what we're going to talk about now, we're going to talk about chloroplasts, and we're going to talk about the cell wall. So when we think about chloroplasts, animal cells have chloroplasts. And we also learned yesterday that I believe it was Euglena has chloroplasts as well, even though that's kind of that's a prokaryote. It still photosynthesizes. So these are the chloroplasts, and so anything that is indicated that looks similar to this, or it says that if you're reading in directions and it says green, you can pretty much guess that that's a pretty good indicator of a chloroplast. So the chloroplast makes the plants green. It has the chlorophyll. So the chlorophyll is actually what makes the plants green, but the chloroplast houses the chlorophyll. So let me actually erase this because I want to make sure we get this right. So it houses the chloroplast, but more importantly, it also houses, as we talked about last semester, radiant energy and photosynthesis. It houses that radiant energy, and so when the radiant energy and the chlorophyll combine with each other, then it turns into a chemical energy, and that is the catalyst for photosynthesis. And actually, let me erase this because I wrote chloroplast and it is chlorophyll, and that is the thing that we're talking about. But the analogy that I would use to just kind of remember this is that it's like a green dye, and that was one that some of you guys came up with when we were doing our analogies activity, and I thought that was as good of an analogy as you can get, because that's really what it does. So that's very, very critical for plants, because if they do not have this chemical energy, they cannot make their own food, and that's the whole thing about plants, is they undergo photosynthesis and they make their own food. So chloroplast is very important, and it is specific to plant cells. So as we move on to I believe this is the last slide, or the last organelle that we're going to discuss, we're going to be looking about the cell wall. Now, when you go in and you have to label something and you don't know if it's a plant or an animal cell, or you're looking at structures to identify whether or not it's a plant or animal cell, one of the easiest things, we talked about obviously the vacuole, and looking for which organelle is the nucleus. We know this is the nucleus because it has this little nucleolus. And so we've got nucleus, nucleolus, and we see this large vacuole. Yes, it's a plant cell, but the real thing that identifies that it's a plant cell is the cell wall. And so here is our cell membrane, and there's another structure outside of it. So we know that that has to be the cell wall, and that is this big thing right here. And so the cell wall has a variety of purposes. One of them, it kind of reminds me, the best thing that I think about it is it's like a castle. And it guards and protects the cell. It also allows plants, or the tissues, we'll say plant tissue, to grow tall and be rigid. So they can stand up and be stable in an environment outside. So I like to think of it kind of like the castle wall that protects and guards the plant cell. So as we finish up and wrap this video up, we have talked about so in closing, we have talked about several organelles, including the nucleus, which acts like the brain of the cell, and it kind of gives out the orders and it communicates through chemicals. We've talked about the cell membrane, and this acts like a door, and it lets proteins and waters and sugars and good things in and out of the cell. The vacuole, which we know is the storage facility, if you will, of the cell, kind of like a refrigerator, houses the food, water, and waste of the cell. And we know that a plant cell has one very large vacuole, and an animal cell has several smaller vacuoles. We've also talked about the mitochondria, and that is, if we can think of it, it's like a power bar, an energy bar, and that provides the energy, the cell with the energy that it needs, because as we know, you have a finite amount of energy, as well as cells. Cells have a finite amount of energy, and so when that energy is up, they're going to have to go to the mitochondria to get their energy restored. We've also talked about genetic material, and when we talk about prokaryotes and eukaryotes, both of them have genetic material. In a eukaryote, or a cell with a nucleus, that is stored in the nucleus, but in a prokaryote, the genetic material is just floating around in the cell. We've also talked about the cell wall and the chloroplasts, which are specific to plant cells. And the cell wall acts like a castle, and it guards the cell, helps it grow very tall and rigid. And then the chloroplasts house the radiant energy that plants take in from the sun, as well as the chlorophyll. And together, those things combine and create chemical energy, and that is the catalyst for photosynthesis. So that's what allows plants to photosynthesize. So I hope you found this helpful, and we will be back probably with mitosis and some more on cell theory. So I will see you next time.